Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name is Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Chris Cutrone, who teaches critical theory at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago and the Institute for Clinical Social Work. He completed his PhD on Adorno's Marxism at the University of Chicago and is also the lead organizer of the Platypus Affiliated Society. And today we're going to be talking about his latest book, The Death of the Millennial Left, Interventions in between 2006 and 2022. So great to have you on, Chris, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time. Perhaps it would be best to just get a general overview on you and your work, where you've come from, your inspirations. The start of this book is very personal, giving a sort of a historical overview of your political interventions and interests and inclinations. So maybe let's just start there, and welcome.
Well, so my history on the left goes back to high school. And so I was a kind of a adolescent leftist, from a young age, and even considered myself a Marxist from a young age. I read the Communist Manifesto as a teenager. Then I had a more intense engagement. So I did activism as a young person, but then I had a more intense engagement in college. I went to a very lefty undergraduate college, Hampshire College, which has some reputation as a kind of a lefty school and sometimes is in the news for controversial things. But I had, former New Left, like former Students for a Democratic Society and other kind of activist professors in college. And I also was recruited to the youth organization of a Trotskyist group, the Spartacist League, which is, again, a kind of a controversial group. And I developed a mentorship while I was in college with Adolph Reed, who was an important mentor of mine. But then at the end of my college years, I really took a break from the left for a while. And so I had friends who were still active on the left, maybe most notably Richard Rubin, who had been involved in the Spartacus Youth Club with me at Hampshire. And so I did sort of touch base with the left occasionally. And then also it just so happened that Adolph Reed and I both relocated to Chicago around the same time. And so we reconnected there. And I was peripherally involved in his Labor Party project in Chicago, and met a very good friend of mine, Stephanie Karamitsos, through Adolph. So she provided the art for the cover of the book, which is nice. And but generally I was not terribly involved in the left. I still occasionally went to left events, went to some protest demos, met leftists in Chicago and people who came through town, but was kind of keeping my distance. As a young professor, so still working on my PhD, but already working more than full-time as an adjunct faculty member. Back then, it was easier to get such positions after you do your qualifying exams before you're actually done. At the University of Chicago, and where I was working on my PhD, and at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I still teach today. And in the context of the anti-war movement, which began before I started teaching at SAIC anyway, students who I was academically instructing in Marxism and in critical theory, in Frankfurt School critical theory, approached me about doing extracurricular reading in a more political vein. And so another important mentor of mine, one of my dissertation committee members, is Moishe Postone, who's got some fame as a Marx scholar, as an interpreter of Marx. And we started out by reading a piece that he wrote, which actually seems pretty timely now. It's a piece that he wrote in 2006 called History and Helplessness. We actually, those of us who got involved in the extracurricular reading group, my undergraduate students but also some of my graduate student friends who were also instructors, and some of their students. Me and my fellow graduate students of Moish, we had access to a kind of pre-publication draft of the article, and so we talked about it with our students in the context of the anti-war movement at that moment. And eventually it grew into what is now Platypus. But originally Platypus was supposed to be something else, namely a journal project. Like a lot of people on the left, I thought about starting a journal. And I'm glad that we didn't. We did, in the context of Platypus as an organization, begin a periodical, the Platypus Review, but that really is not like a journal in the way that we originally conceived of it. So I would say that that brought me back into the left, at least to some extent. As a teacher, as a mentor, as an advisor. And back then also, the left and Platypus itself were rather activist oriented. So more activist oriented than Platypus has been since then. At least, the activism has come and gone over the course of the last 16, 17 years. And so I wrote the articles in this book as a kind of commentary or, thought pieces, essays on current events, mostly in the kind of capitalist political world, rather than, I also address things on the left in particular in those moments. But, really looking at what I saw as a crisis in mainstream politics that began already with the war on terror, with the George W. Bush administration, and also with the Great Recession and the election of Barack Obama, and then finally up through the Trump era. The essays in the book don't really get too much into Biden. The Ukraine war is probably as close as I get to the Biden administration and the era we've been in the last few years. But yeah, this is, I'll just say, part one of a 2-volume collection of my writings, written for Platypus and also in the time of my involvement in Platypus. The second volume will be longer and in some ways more substantial because it will be my theoretical writings. And so most of my writings for Platypus have been theoretical in character, have been sort of short essays on theoretical issues in the history of Marxism, is the way that I would put it. But Doug Lane, my publisher with Sublation, kind of convinced me to publish the first volume, The Death of the Millennial Left, first, as a kind of an entree into my thinking. But also perhaps based on some notoriety that I've accumulated over time, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you think about it. But kind of unfortunately, especially around the election of Trump, where, I took a kind of equivocal attitude and also posed, the question of, oh, why not Trump? Why is the left opposed to Trump in the way that it is? And, as a kind of a symptom, especially because I understood the Trump phenomenon very much alongside the Bernie phenomenon, right? So I saw those two things as being really tied. You can't really understand one without the other. And, I had, as a young person, lived in the shadow of the Reagan Revolution, which the left in my time saw as the kind of putting an end to the new left. So it's a kind of a culminating moment and also a kind of defeat. It's a kind of victory of the right against the 60s new left. That's the way it was understood. And then everything that followed was blamed on Reagan. And the Reagan Revolution in the UK blamed on Thatcher. Outside the UK and Europe, it's a little bit more mixed. We could talk about Francois Mitterrand being the first neoliberal leader of France in many respects, although he was of the nominal left. So I saw the millennial left that had, in a sense, brought me out of retirement from the left, taking a similar course to the 1960s New Left. And similarly, blaming Trump, at least potentially, I saw that coming, for their own failure, as the 60s left had done with Reagan and Thatcher, and with neoliberalism more generally. Right. So that's basically, the kind of logic of the book, is the kind of different phases, different ways of approaching different angles on the crisis of mainstream capitalist politics and society that accompanied the trajectory of the millennial left.
Yeah, I really appreciate. I've been following a lot of your recent work on sublation, on Theory Underground, and I really appreciate not only your sort of political positionality, but the way in which you include your personal history into that positionality in such a way is that I think it gives a almost like a missing piece in the puzzle of leftist discourse, specifically to me in regards to what you're talking about as the 1980s reaction against, the figures like Reagan and Thatcher.
Mm-hmm.
And this gap between the 1960s imagination of the left and what you, I think correctly, as I'm sort of smack dab in the middle of the millennial left, that the millennial left defeated themselves. I certainly feel that way as well. And you say failed to become something genuinely new, that
Yeah.
they just remained within the shadow of the 1960s. Here I'm, and rest in peace, but here I'm getting sort of visions of the type of work I was reading when I was into David Graeber.
Right.
Because when I read David Graeber a lot, and at a time was really called to his political orientation. But I feel like a lot of that was kind of, there's a lot to take there, but in some sense there's a lot that still seemed in the shadow of the 1960s. In terms of the political imagination that's
Right.
going on there.
Right.
Right. And so again, I feel like you're capturing this piece of the real from the 1980s, and also sort of directing it at this almost aborted leftist project of the millennials. And just to get to a question here, I'd say, the way you start the book, it seems like a slogan of the book when you say the left is dead, long live the left, pointing towards the future possibilities of the left at the same time as saying the left is dead.
Yeah.
What do you see in this possibility space? When I take your point about the death of the millennial left, where do you see things right now in terms of possibilities?
Okay, so it's tricky because I would say that, of course, the original formulation, the left is dead, long live the left, I came up with that when Platypus was first starting. And what I had in mind was, okay, I have young people around me, students who are genuinely curious and open, and really open to reconsidering things. And I thought, well, who are the mentors going to be? And I thought about my mentors. I thought about the Spartacus League. I thought about Adolf Reed. I thought about Moise Postone. Right. So would the young people be well served by the people who were my mentors? So what I had in mind about the dead left was, the Spartacus League, Adolf Reed, Moishe Postone. So I did want my students to learn from them, but also to not just operate under their shadow, right? I wanted them to understand that we had to go beyond this and go beyond the perspective of my generation, right? So go beyond the 60s generation and go beyond the Gen X, the 80s generation, and 80s, 90s generation. And so you mentioned David Graeber. So of course he had an inspirational role around Occupy Wall Street, right? So he did get a millennial audience for sure. And I have my criticisms of David Graeber, but right, again, that highlights the issue, which is to say, learn from the past, but don't be beholden to it or stuck in it. Now, this is going to sound paradoxical because actually I'm very much a fan of the deep, deep past of the left and, what I call original historical Marxism from over 100 years ago. When we first started Platypus, by the way, one of my colleagues at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago said, Chris Cutrone is trying to take the left back 50 years. And I said, a great deal longer than that. Right. In other words, they were complaining that I was threatening to take the left back to, I guess, the 60s, or maybe prior to the 60s, maybe the pre-New Left moment, to some kind of old left. That's the way they understood it. And I, of course, thought, no, it's more like 80 years. And now it's, 100 years or more. And so, when did the left die? I would say, so even though I thought that the millennials needed to come out from under the shadow of the 60s, I do consider the 60s to be an authentic moment of potential rebirth. And now by the left, what I mean is a socialist left. And whether or not that's a Marxist left in particular is a little bit of an open question for me. In other words, I think that Marxism is important, but I also think it would have to be done differently now. The problem being that usually post-Marxism means something sub-Marxist, doesn't actually mean beyond Marxism. And so that's where I feel like we have to remember this deeper history, which, again, the 60s did wrestle with. The 60s New Left did wrestle with it, and they did make a genuine attempt at recovery. And I also saw the millennials doing something similar, right? Really reconsidering the whole history. Even the DSA and Jacobin magazine, someone like Bhaskar Sankara, who I've been personally acquainted with from early on, from before Jacobin, was thinking about old Marxism, pre-World War I Marxism. Karl Kautsky as a Marxist, and what kind of political movement and political party did such people participate in back then as the aspiration? Right, that's been pretty much abandoned. But again, so the left being dead, and then long live the left, meaning the spirit of it, the task of it. Right, so it's based on the king is dead, long live the king. All right, that's the phrase. Meaning that the person dies, but the kingship lives on, and let's hope that the inheritor, the next in line, is able to carry on. Right? Now, so I did not, in 2006, I was not thinking about the ultimate demise of the millennial left. I was not. I was thinking that the task for me was to be open to new possibilities. In other words, not to impose my vision on young people, but to remind them of things, but also be open to where they might take them. It's kind of a hard thing to, the way that I always put it was, I understand these ideas in a particular way. but what really matters is how you understand it. Right? I mean, I'm a teacher.
Yeah.
That's really
Yeah.
what it boils down to. I'm a teacher, and so I always know that that's what's going on.
No, I think I picked that up from your other conversations as well, is that you are really committed to the craft of teaching, and that's something I'm extremely respectful of, in the sense of the axiom that I try to embody at Philosophy Portal is actually, I took it from Nietzsche, which is, you don't want followers, you want children. And
Yes.
the difference between followers and children is that children are going to disagree with you.
Yes.
And children are going to find their own way, and that's the way
Yes.
it should be, and that's the way it should
Yes.
be. Because if you have followers, of course, you're just reproducing a certain logic,
And it's a kind
and
of a dead end.
yeah. Well, it stops with you.
Stops with you.
The
That's
buck
right.
stops with you.
That's right.
So whereas children is much more open to life because they're children. It's the
Yep.
future. So and that's, I think, the disposition of an ethical teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate that, and it's rare to find, and at the same time a difficult balance to strike, when
It is.
there is a real experience and there is a real knowledge which is in need of transmission.
Yes. Yes.
It's kind of like it's a balancing act. It's a tightrope walk.
I
uh
had to wrestle with my teachers in that way, meaning that I had to sort of press them to get the best out of them, you know? Um, because, there are other students, I'll say, kind of accepted ready-made, to use a Marx phrase from his discussion of the young Hegelians, that the young Hegelians took Hegel ready-made, right? And so because of that, it was less than the master, right? Whereas I really pressed my teachers to help me experience their own process, their own like learning, their own education, to kind of reproduce that with me. Which they were usually annoyed by, because I'd press on the ambiguities or the contradictions, and I wasn't trying to trip them up. I just wanted to know, but yeah, you struggled with this, didn't you? And how did you struggle with it? Because I wanted to relate to it that way.
yeah, I mean, I think it's from the perspective of a younger individual. A professor can easily parade him or herself as a ready-made perfect object to project onto and to identify with, and to, as it were, reduce anxiety of the
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
uncertainty of the moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas, of course, every teacher, every well-educated individual became what they became through a deep struggle.
Yep.
And how do you communicate the cracks of that struggle in such a way as that you, as it were, don't I don't know, delegitimize yourself, but at the same time show that you're a mortal being
Oh,
who's
yeah.
flawed and fallible, and all of that. And I think the interesting vehicle I would like to dive into in regards to your teaching is just the symbol of the Platypus Society, because
Uh-huh.
I think that it's a very interesting metaphor
Mm-hmm.
that emerged there. So you say in the book that the Platypus Society it comes from this idea of an organism which was unclassifiable at the time of its discovery in this weird zone. Is it a mammal? Is it is it a reptile? What is this thing?
Neither fish nor fowl.
Yeah, neither fish nor fowl. And I think that could connect to the point I was trying to make of, where do you see the left today? Where is the possibilities for the left today? Because you say that in the same way, the left is this unclassifiable thing at the moment. It's where do we, is it fish or fowl? And in that sense, when I see things like, for example, Theory Underground popping up, You know, it's an example of a platypus. It's an
Mm-hmm.
example of something which is not easy to classify. If we could
Mm-hmm.
say our friend David with Theory Underground as an example of this, but
Mm-hmm.
perhaps also the stuff you're doing with the Platypus Society and the people associated with that. It's sort of it's not, these people are not, and I've met some of your students. These people are not what the general public would consider the
Yes.
Biden left or the
Oh,
Clinton
sure.
left, right? It's not classifiable in that sense, and it's not classifiable either in the popular woke sense of left, right? So maybe could you expand a little bit about what's going on here with this concept and where you see the possibility space?
Right. So okay, so here's the other thing. So of course, so it comes from an Engels anecdote. And actually it was my friend Richard Rubin who came up with the idea of calling the journal Platypus. And again, the platypus is its own organism. It's its own thing, and it is what it is. It isn't like a mixture of other things. It's not a hybrid, right? And yet Engels, when he first heard about it, he thought, well, no, some taxidermist had stitched together different pieces to create this hybrid monster. And platypus can look like that. So platypus can look like neocons, or they can look like ultra left Marxist purists, or like it can look like that's where we're coming from. But really that's what's happened to Marxism, first of all, but also more generally the broader left. That's what's happened to it, is that by turning the left into a series of political positions, right, kind of a set of opinions, really, all the life is taken out of it, right? So like the taxidermy metaphor, right, of this and that, what's your position on Israel Palestine, to take something from the headlines, that's going to define you. And rather than thinking, well, what would a leftist perspective on this be, actually? And that's an open question, and it may not be immediately classifiable or even recognizable according to the received wisdom, right? And even the doxa, to use a old like a Greek word, right? The kind of common sense, the dominant opinion on the left, right? That actually the positions, if you will, or the opinions, but not really, just the general approach, the framework of like older generations of leftists would be quite different from the assumptions that people have now, right? And again, the left has this kind of, and so you mentioned like Dave and Theory Underground. I think that Dave is sensitive to this kind of phenomenon, that people on the left are quick to detect like heterodoxy, right? Are you diverting from orthodoxy and this kind of thing? And so again, from any number of orthodox perspectives, I think an authentic left, a socialist left, and one that could make use of the history of Marxism, would not fit any of the various tendencies that are out there, whether Marxist or anarchist, right? It wouldn't be assimilable to any of those. It also wouldn't be assimilable to some assemblage of them, like the taxidermy metaphor, right? It's not like you can just sort of piece things together either. It would be its own thing for its own time, right? It would have to do with some kind of history. The platypus comes out of natural history, but it's not a hybrid of other things. It can't be classified really, and it's its own thing. And that would be the authentically new and different character of a genuine left today, I think.
So when you say, for example, and you start off the book and I think end the book with the same idea, which is the traditions, and the quote from Marx, traditions of dead generations weighing like a nightmare on the brains of the living. which is a very powerful statement. Is this connected in the sense of emphasizing for our own time, and then in terms of its relationship to natural history or social history?
That's right. So I think the same text as the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte by Marx. He says, the revolution of today must take its poetry from the future. It's a very tricky kind of formulation because it might lead you to believe that it's like an image of the future that one is following or crafting. The poetry of the future, the kind of spirit, the sort of je ne sais quoi of possibility, right? Because, famously Marx is not with, he doesn't come with blueprints, doesn't come with, he comes with a certain kind of perspective for what he thinks are the immediate tasks, but he doesn't have an image, right? So the poetry of the future is a kind of an intent, right? It's an intent to free oneself from the nightmare of the past. Now, of course, one can't entirely free oneself from the past. One has to overcome it, struggle through it, overcome it. The past is not dead. It's not even past. But the tradition, right? That's really the issue. And, I have in mind, I do some academic teaching with Gadamer, hermeneutics, the idea that actually the way a tradition keeps itself alive is to change, right? So a tradition dies by being followed too strictly, right? So the issue is, how are we unthinkingly following the tradition of dead generations?
I love that. I love that. There's a lot coming to my mind based on what you just said there on Gadamer. So a few things. The first thing is I'm thinking about the history of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about the history of specifically the break from Catholicism,
Mm-hmm.
but also many of the Christian atheist movements. Like, to me, even when you think of someone like Hegel, the idealist, when you think of Marx, when you think of Nietzsche, I see all these people as, in some sense, Christian atheists, because they're tarrying with they're in some sense, they're keeping the tradition alive by changing it completely in some sense. And then, thinking about that in just the context of communism itself, what's coming to my mind in regards to your text is what you say about the 1960s kind of being scared of the I don't know if it's the exact quote, but as it were, the ghost of Stalin, and that Lenin necessarily leads to Stalin, and that this is holding the left, whether for good or for ill, but that this is holding the left's imagination back in some sense. And I want to go into precisely in regards to changing the tradition to keep it alive. What would it mean to go deeper into this presupposition that a Lenin leads to a Stalin, and the consequences that follow?
Right. Well, it's hard to shake the association of Marxism with what happened in the 20th century. And, there was a kind of reversal, in a way, Marxism became its opposite. I think the Trotsky called Stalinism the antithesis of Bolshevism. Right? There's that kind of a phrase. And again, what does that mean? And is that meant dialectically? How does one understand that? And so I think that with the idea of being, beholden to the past, being sort of transfixed by it, right? And then responding either negatively or positively to it, meaning you either slavishly follow the past or you utterly reject it, right? That needs to be understood as a kind of a symptom. And that's still with us. So that 60s moment, unfortunately, is still with us. We do have neo-Stalinism now, as well as a kind of Cold War social democracy, right? The DSA, Michael Harrington. And you have a kind of a mixture of these things, which is remarkable, right? But I think that with respect to, Lenin not leading to Stalin, and I see that in my own study of the history of Marxism, exemplified by figures like Trotsky and the Frankfurt School, that it means that there was a possibility, represented by Lenin, that was not fulfilled. Right. So the problem is when you flatten history, when you say it had to happen the way it did, when you affirm history as it happened, then what you do is you say all the potential that was there was actually realized. Whereas I think, no, there was a possibility that went unfulfilled by subsequent events. And so I think that, that's a hard one, though, for people to wrestle with. In other words, how could Marxism become its opposite? How could the revolution become a counter-revolution? Now, you mentioned Hegel, so I'll just say about Hegel's approach to Christianity. I was just teaching Hegel this week. On Monday, I was teaching the introductory lectures on aesthetics. And, it's a peculiar way of getting into Hegel. It's in a philosophy of modernism course that I teach. So it's about philosophy of modern aesthetics. Now, you can't do all of Hegel through that, but there's enough there that I had to sort of indicate what's going on. Namely, so you mentioned the kind of Christian communism. Well, really, it's bourgeois society itself, right? And the Protestant Reformation is part of that. That is both the fulfillment and the negation of Christianity, right? That's the way Hegel understood it. And that's why Hegel can be seen as an atheist philosopher or as a Christian philosopher, because actually what he is a bourgeois philosopher. And what that means is that he's giving expression to, he's trying to capture, kind of grasp the way that bourgeois society both fulfilled and overcame and seemed to negate Christianity at the same time. Now, the struggle for socialism, the struggle to overcome capitalism, to my mind, and again, this is a kind of a controversial point, and it's not really articulated so much in the book. The closest I come to it is The American Revolution and the Left, that essay, is to say that, of course, the struggle for socialism or for communism, to use Marx's language, is for the realization of the potential and promise of bourgeois society. And that, again, it's a tricky relationship there, because one doesn't want to simply affirm capitalism as the fulfillment of bourgeois society, although it can look like that, and it can look like a kind of a mockery of bourgeois society. But we have to pay attention to why it appears to be a mockery of it. In other words, that capitalism seems justified by the revolutionary ideas of bourgeois society. And yet, clearly, they are not fulfilled, right? And so the older Marxist tradition was very keen to say capitalism betrays this freedom, and it's the task of socialism to realize it. That's hard, though, because, we're living in a very negative moment. So at the tail end of the millennial left, there has been a kind of desperate attempt to negate history, right? Tearing down the statues in 2020, and really, what are those statues? Obviously Robert E. Lee is not this, but the others, Thomas Jefferson, even for Christ's sake, Christopher Columbus. And I say that intending the irony. He was not a conquistador, but he opened the door to the conquistadors. Right? He was a bourgeois mariner, and that doesn't mean he wasn't a son of a bitch too. But he's a Renaissance man. He's one of these people, right? He is inaugurating bourgeois society and, freedom. right? For the whole world, not, it's not like, oh, the Europeans liberated the Native Americans. Of course they did not. But the historical process, right? And that process hopefully is not over, right? That process of emancipation, of freedom is not over, even if the task is new and different under capitalism than it was before. And that's why we can't just uphold, I don't know, 1776, 1789. We can't just uphold these things straightforwardly because that would be ideological. But we do have to be true to the spirit of them, nonetheless. And that's not to say that's not difficult and tricky. It is difficult and tricky, and it's even self-contradictory. Something similar might be the case with the left, the socialist left, the communist left, the Marxist left as well, right? I of course think we can't just embrace the history of Stalinism as a kind of messy, contradictory process and just pick up with the Chinese Communist Party today or something and say, okay, the struggle continues. I do think it's important to realize that certain traditions were broken, but not in a good way. Especially in places like the United States or France, Western Europe, the United States, East Asia, the capitalist developed world. The tradition has been broken, but not overcome. Right. So like I said, we're in a very negative moment, and I do understand that as a symptom of the death of the millennial left, meaning with the failure of the millennial left, I think that there's been this nihilistic turn.
In a lot of what you're saying there, I get the feeling like the angle you're pushing for is more of a sublation instead of a negation.
Right.
That we well, you preserve at the same time as you cancel. And so in the example, for example, of just let's get rid of Columbus Day or something like that, or let's tear down the Jefferson statue or something like that. That there's a more there is the possibility of sublation here, and to use I guess the shout out to Sublation Media.
Elfenbahn, the Elfenbahn.
Yeah, exactly.
The transcendence.
Sure.
Right. So the fulfillment and the negation, the completion and the transcendence, the abolition and the preservation. Right. But the transcendence, I think, makes it easier to understand, meaning we have to transcend the society, not simply negate it.
Well, what I see in the opening of your book as pushing towards that is the transcendence of society as opposed to just the negation of it, is what you call critical historical consciousness.
Right.
And critical historical consciousness specifically, I think it's something I rack my brain over, my mind over, and have those feelings I expressed to you before going on recording, at the feelings of impotence in regards to what you were talking about as revolutionary authority and revolutionary organization. So in specifically on the level of critical historical consciousness, it's not, and transcending society, it's how do we, after the death of the millennial left, rethink authority and organization, which seem to be incredibly, that those are the trickiest questions to my mind. So what are you pointing towards, maybe, with just this idea of the critical historical consciousness?
Okay, so it's easy for us in the present to have a critique of the past, right? To have a critical attitude towards the past, to say, look at how horrible they were. Look at all these bad things that were done. Again, in what I would consider to be a kind of a subcritical way, but let's just use the colloquial use of the term. The more difficult challenge is allowing the past to critique the present. Right? So it's easy for us to say, oh, well, we know better now. We are better ethical human beings than Christopher Columbus or than Thomas Jefferson, right? That's easy. What's more difficult is, how does the past criticize us? So can we be judged meaningfully, substantially, by a past standard rather than assuming progress and judging the past according to our standard, right? So critical historical consciousness of history that's critical of the present, that's critical of us. Can we accept the past's critique of us? That's hard. And, I think the sense of paralysis that you describe can also come from that, from the sense of implication, the sense of, oh, look at what people did in the past, why can't we do that now? Right? So a kind of a, I don't know, inferiority kind of complex with regard to the past. That's tricky. That is like paralyzing.
Just sort of taking it from this, I think, crucial point that you're making about reversing the way we tend to see critical consciousness in the past and the present. I want to make I'll make a funny connection that Zizek always says with Hegel. He says it's not about what we think of Hegel, but what Hegel thinks of us, or something.
Yeah.
But it's you could do the same thing with Marx and whatever
Yep.
thinker that. But it's an interesting little trick, and I think it's an interesting way to bring that into our thought as it relates to your work at the Platypus Society. Just the fact that you said there's a second volume,
Yes,
coming out of your writing, that's more theoretical based. I almost think that the question I want to ask is maybe a question I should save to read your second volume, but maybe we could just go into it a little bit, which is,
yep.
You say that some of the key figures that structure your thinking and the Platypus Society is Marx, Kant, Hegel, Lukács, Benjamin, and Adorno. Is how are these thinkers helping us? And maybe there are others you'd add, but how are these thinkers helping us move towards what you say is the revolution that Marx envisioned must occur? Are these all helping us think revolutionary, the revolutionary future, or how do you bring those to bear on the present?
Right. So first of all, of course, that's Marx as a theorist. So those are all theoretical figures. So, left out of that are people like Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin and, others. So as critical theorists, how does theory, if you will, task us politically? So it's mediated, right? It's not direct. Meaning that, theory doesn't translate into practice immediately. Now, revolutionary, and this is something that's tricky, and it is something that I talk about in this volume, but I also take up in the second volume, that it's not a matter of like being revolutionary exactly. It's more a matter of the task of the revolution. Right, Lenin has a famous phrase, no one is revolutionary enough. It's impossible to be revolutionary enough. One has to be as radical as reality itself. Right, so we're still living in, I think, manifestly, I think it's kind of clear, although sometimes it's not clear, we're still living in revolutionary times. In a way that not all periods of history have been revolutionary. Right? It's not that things didn't change, things happened, things changed, but not like our time. Not like the last 200 years and in an ongoing way. And so it's about being true to that, at least insofar as we can. Now, there's a way of being true to that in thinking. There's also a way of being true to it in practice, in action. Right, so in theory and in practice, in thinking and in action, those are actually quite different things. So thinking is about registering, or theory is about registering our recognition of the task. Now, realizing that, or accepting the task, trying to realize the task, trying to achieve the task in practice is a whole other thing. It is. So, the thing with that list of names is that they decidedly don't seem to provide any guide to action. I remember my old comrades, the Spartacist League, they said, Marxism is not a guide to thinking, it's a guide to action. Well, what if Marxism right now might be more a guide to thinking than to action? Right? Does that mean it's useless? No, I don't think so. Right? So again, I think that one of the things that frustrates people about Platypus and about me is that I accept that theory and practice have become separated, which is a big no-no in usual Marxist circles, but also it's a no-no in like what I would take to be a general romantic attitude towards one's own subjectivity, one's own agency, and towards social and political reality. What we want is the unity of theory and practice. Well, that may not be easily available. It might simply be the case that, of course, we're always inhabiting a unity of theory and practice. But in this sense, right, can we accept that the connection between theory and practice is actually obscure right now? Right now, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the hybrid and about, the platypus animal being its own thing, not being a mixture of other things. Which is to say that, I think it's very unclear what the action of the present is doing historically. So we're living in a time of which side of history are you on? Are you on the right side of history? Are you on the wrong side of history? That's what brings Hegel to mind, I think. All right, so when you mention Zizek and how he invokes Hegel, I do think that from a Marxist perspective and from an active socialist perspective, one would have to have a different attitude than Hegel did. In other words, Hegel could do a post festum, ex post facto, retrospective view of the French Revolution and say, well, what did it all amount to? But what about in the living moment of struggle? You can't have that perspective, right? And so the owl of Minerva, of knowledge and wisdom flying at dusk, that's true. But that doesn't tell us how our action should be critically informed by our theoretical perspective. It really doesn't, right? And I think that, so Adorno is my baby, if you will. Adorno is the one who was the subject of my dissertation. And so he's the one I studied the most. Him and Lenin, I probably have studied the most. And after that, Marx. But, he wrote about this towards the end of his life, which is, he remarked on the 1960s New Left, the impatience with theory and what he called actionism, which he called pseudoactivity. So he said that pseudoactivity and actionism was really succumbing to the pseudo-reality of capitalism. Meaning capitalism is going to present you with these things, and it's going to make you think that you have to take urgent action. But that's actually still capitalism. That's still part of capitalism. That's, it's like, the anxiety that a commodity is supposed to resolve for you, right? It's like advertising makes you anxious and it sells you the commodity that's meant to assuage your anxiety. Of course, it never does, right? Unfortunately, the left is largely that, right? And so, again, is there a moment for thinking? Is there a moment for theory? Can we have the patience for that? Or are we driven irresistibly to urgent action? So, again, the ironies of history are for posterity to decide, right? And I think that if we adopt the perspective of like Hegel and the French Revolution, then we could say, well, all these things that seem kind of evil, like, wrongfully killing people in the Jacobin Terror, or the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon as emperor, that are very problematic at the very least, but maybe even evil, that, oh, well, we can embrace them as historically justified in the present. We can say history will judge this to be justified. No, I'm not sure about that.
The
Right.
cunning of
So
reason.
cunning of reason is fine in
Yeah.
retrospect, but it's no
Yeah.
way to conduct yourself in the present. It really
It's
isn't.
very interesting. This relationship between theory and action. And you're right, I think, to suggest that there is a certain dogma in Marxism about praxis. And emphasis on action. I myself have let's say gone through a phase where that was very much at the forefront of my thinking. Now at Philosophy Portal, the image is an owl.
Mm-hmm.
So I've gone
Minerva.
more. I've gone to the Minerva position and gone to the thinking position because yeah, because quite frankly, I of not knowing how to act, not knowing what to do, and I want to connect that to something that I thought was resonated with me from your book, which is basically saying, we, like you've been saying, we live in a time of change, and of course, one of the symptoms of this living in a time of change, we have accelerationist philosophy.
Right.
Michael Downs is going to be teaching Nick Land and
Uh-huh.
the accelerationist point of view, and I was even myself when I was younger studying a lot of Kurzweil,
Uh-huh.
and the singularity thought, and but what you emphasized in your book, in regards to change, is change happening, and this is
Mm-hmm.
pretty much a direct quote: is change happening beyond our control, and are we merely registering our pain in the transition of that, and how are we to function of that change? And I think that resonated with me because I had that's back to the feeling of impotence I was describing. Is like there's this change happening,
Mm-hmm.
and there's other people who have commented on this feeling of political impotence, but just this feeling like nothing I do matters. If I even act, what am I going to change? But at the same time, things are changing, and it seems painful. So
Yes.
so 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 yeah. I mean, what was going through your mind maybe when you were writing that, and where are you now with that idea?
Well, yeah, change is painful, and the ongoing change is painful still, right? So we're still in this moment. We're still in a very much a crisis moment, maybe symbolized by the fact that, Trump will be a candidate for president next year. We're still in that era. We're still in the Trump era. We're not so much in the Bernie era, right? And so that is painful, right? And the millennial generation, and of course me also, as someone living through the same era, I point out that they suffered a great number of historical traumas that are real and that have an impact. And so I do think that, are we just, I think it's a cry of emancipation before accommodation, right? Meaning, or excuse me, a cry of pain before accommodation, right? So we might think that we are, crying out for freedom. We are, but what we're really doing is succumbing, accommodating. So that, I think, for me is the difficulty, because on the one hand, there is suffering and there is a kind of an anguish. There's a pathos, but can we think beyond that in the moment? right? That's the urgency of action, I think. Something must be done now. That idea. And, again, what to do, but also, can we do it? Even if we knew what to do, can we actually do it? Are we in a position to do it? So I saw my own conception at the outset of the millennial left is that they could have represented a beginning of something that would take time to fully flower and bear fruit. Right. So my sense of it was that this is going to take some time. This is the beginning of something. And that's the promise of it, is that it is the beginning of something. Now, looked at from the other perspective, after, to my mind, it's ended, we can be stuck in a kind of melancholic place. We can be in a kind of depressed place. And maybe even an anxious place too, right? A narcissistic place in any case. And I think that there's more pain to come. We're in the middle of change, right? And, how can we deal with it? From my perspective as an older person, what legacy am I going to leave? Right? Because I do think this task will be taken up in some way in the future. And we'll need resources. So I'm very conscious. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm publishing these books now, is to say, okay, I achieved a certain kind of clarity because my mind was focused by this millennial left moment. And I want to preserve that for posterity. I want to preserve that for what future generations will need. And future generations could mean just tomorrow, right? It doesn't have to be far, far into the future. But in any case, what's going to be left of this experience? So it kind of was my experience. It wasn't exactly my experience, but I tried to be true to what I took to be the needs of the millennial generation. So as an older person, what did I remember from history? Not only the history of my own time, but how I had been taught history by those who came before me. Right. So these are the kinds of thorny problems that one has to engage.
So there's a lot of thorny problems. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned in your book and what you just mentioned now, I think my glasses are fogging, is this: we're in the Trump era, not the Bernie era. And for me, it actually was a critical moment in the breaking of my consciousness. Was the day Trump got elected. I was very politically engaged before Trump was elected. And then the day Trump was elected, for various reasons of my personal life and where I am and all this stuff, I was just like, I'm turning it off. Like I'm cut. This is not good for my conscience. This is not good for me. And again, that feeling of out of control. And in some sense, just paying attention peripherally, but mostly going to philosophy. And going deeper into philosophy. And that's basically what I said to myself, is I need to go deeper into philosophy. But this question comes up in your work, and it actually comes up with a few of my friends. We're talking about politics again. Of you saying, I really resonate with this. Me and some of my friends, we had the same idea, which was Marxists need to occupy the vital center for social emancipation beyond capital, and not opt for this cynical intellectualism or utopian anarchism.
Uh-huh.
And this idea of the Marxists occupying the vital center is, again, I think, calling back to the theme of Lenin that we were
Mm-hmm.
talking about before, and you've
Mm-hmm.
studied in great detail. Um, Also, I'm tempted to connect it to this difference between we're in the Trump era, not the Bernie era,
Yeah.
because I want to know your opinion on that. Basically, is Bernie, and you mentioned in the book, Bernie will use the term socialism in a climate in America where that's sort of seen as taboo. Do you see that movement? Do you see what was going on there as pointing in that direction of the vital center?
It could have. Now, of course, there's the center in terms of capitalist politics, namely some kind of moderate place between the Democrats and the Republicans. Um, so center left, center right, that kind of idea. Now, there's also the crossover idea. So, you know, I do think that it was significant that people who supported Bernie in the Democratic Party primaries ended up voting for Trump. There were a good number of people like that. And in fact, Bernie started out um, reaching for so-called independent voters, or also people who would have maybe otherwise voted for Republicans, and the so-called Reagan Democrats that Bill Clinton won back and Obama won back, right? But also then Trump won again. And I think that, again, rather than thinking of Bernie as far left and Trump as far right, to think that they were both phenomena of the need to reconfigure capitalist electoral politics. A fairly kind of superficial phenomenon, but nonetheless has some significance. Meaning they were both reaching out to people who were disaffected with politics. And, they both claimed to have been leading a movement, and Bernie even said a political revolution. And of course, what that meant, and I talk about this in the book, was just a shift in the electorate. Now, the DSA is hoping for that too, right? Jacobin DSA is hoping for that too. I think that that's been lost in the era of the Squad and in the era of Bernie 2.0, like the 2020 primaries. I think that rather the Squad and Bernie came to just symbolize what they would ordinarily symbolize, which is the left wing of the Democratic Party. Now, I think the struggle for socialism and also the perspective of Marxism is not about being the leftmost of capitalist politics. I don't think so. Now, there's a phrase from Trotsky. He has a kind of a thick tome, History of the Russian Revolution, where he says revolutions are moments when the masses enter onto the stage of history. And he says it's up to moral philosophers whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's nonetheless a fact of history. Now, what we had was a much diminished, minimal expression of that, namely the Trump voter, right? And the fright that they were met with. So during the Republican primaries in 2016, the National Review, which is the sort of new right, kind of Reagan era, William F. Buckley Jr. journal, published articles complaining about the Trump voters, saying they'd be better off to all die of opioid overdoses because they're completely useless to society, and the only function that they're serving is to nominate Trump, right? And so they'd be better off dying off. They're just these dysfunctional people. They're, lumpen, basically. They're criminals. They're having children out of wedlock. Like all the racist stereotypes applied to poor Black people was applied to poor white people. And the establishment Republican right had, basically condemned this Trump voter. right? And so again, it's kind of like, well, the masses in some way are going to occasionally put themselves onto the stage of history, and we may not like that from a moral or ethical perspective, but it's also an empirical fact. It's a reality that we have to deal with. Now, the other phrase of Trotsky's that I'll cite is that he says in the same article, so I mentioned, he says Stalinism is the antithesis of Bolshevism. In the same article, it's called Stalinism and Bolshevism. It's from 1937. It's the 20th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. He says that in any case, the Bolsheviks never identified themselves as a party with the working class, or with the masses, or with the revolution itself. Now, that's going to strike people as very strange, right? Meaning that, the revolution, the masses, the working class, they have a logic or a reality of their own. And, a kind of socialist party or a communist party and Marxists operating in such a political party, they're not the same thing. They're not, their consciousness, their program is not identical with the movement of the people. There's an important critical relationship, right? So that's why I raised that, is to say that to reckon with the fact of Trump doesn't mean to be uncritical. The problem is that what passes as criticism is just denunciation and kind of complaint. So what's interesting is, okay, so I can understand what you're saying. When Trump was elected, that was your cue to say, yeah, this politics stuff, no, philosophy, right? For me, and what I was really trying to accomplish in my writing on Trump was, and of course this is damn difficult, cost me some friendships, is to say, now's the time to think, right? But to think about this phenomenon right in front of us, not to withdraw and not think about it, which you can do, by turning to philosophy, or you can do through anti-Trump activism, right? The kind of overheated, immediate protesting against Trump that's carried through up to the present, anti-fascism, what have you. But really, can you attend to this phenomenon and think about it? Is that possible? And what would be, the basic parameters of that, maybe schematically? And so, I write about this in the preface to my book. I recognize that was the task in the Trump moment. But I also realized that I had, in my own thinking and in my own writing, actually prepared for that moment previously, through the Obama moment, through all the things leading up to it, through Occupy Wall Street, the Great Recession. So I had already kind of established for myself a more circumspect place of reflection with regard to current historical events, rather than being swept up in them. And so, of course, it ratcheted up with Trump. I understand that. And like I said, a lot of people got thrown off the merry-go-round of history in that moment, including friends of mine, and couldn't stay on the ride with me. Where I was just saying, look, hang on. Let's think about this. Because the young people need us now. They need us to encourage them about it. But like I said, of course, it's hard. And it was hard for me, right? And I had some resources for doing it. And I felt the need to share those, at least in some outline, basic way. Again, it can appear kind of schematic, but the essential parameters, Trump's not the cause, but the effect. Effect of what? What kind of crisis are we living through? And why it's no more a reason to despair than anything else that the millennials had lived through, right? So the war on terror, could cause a lot of despair. The Great Recession could cause a lot of despair. You know, there are many reasons to despair. So don't make Trump the one to succumb to it.
Yeah, no, I feel you. I think it was, when I'm describing that, it's much more a personal symptom for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel your point of view, and I feel what you're describing in terms of, I feel like now coming back, like there are many things that there are reason to despair over right now. The images in Israel Palestine. I mean,
Yep.
there's plenty. There's plenty. I
Yep.
mean, I feel like I can throw myself out of the picture, but I feel like what I got from doing that was, now I feel like I can come back, engage, think those topics in a way that has a little more emotional or affective distance while being in it, as opposed to where I was at that moment of the political process, at least my personal relationship to it. But in terms of what I'm interested in here is, in some sense, you had the same reaction in terms of that moment you said it's time to think. And I wonder, what was the consequences of that for you? What did you get out of thinking that moment without withdrawing from that moment?
Right. Well, it made me recall things. It made me remember things. It made me think back. Right. So I did try to address Trump as a new thing, but also as the repetition of an old thing, especially with respect to the left. So just taking it sort of phenomenally, Trump was experienced the way Nixon in 1968 or Reagan in 1980 were experienced on the left. And knowing that there was precedent, and knowing that neither Nixon nor Reagan brought about a fascist dictatorship in the United States, right? Neither brought about the crushing of the left, but rather were expressions of the failure of the left, right? So again, the kind of scaremongering, the fear that was used as the reason not to think. So that, being armed with that knowledge, and also being open to the fact that actually Trump is not Nixon or Reagan, and that there is something new and different going on now. And what does it mean that Trump funded Hillary Clinton's Senate campaign and then was her opponent in the 2016 election? Right? What is the significance of that? In other words, what are we talking about here? And so, again, I think there was precedent for it, but there was also reason not to say, okay, and therefore it's over. Because again, in retrospect, it looked like the new left took a bad turn and really gave up after 68. And then in another way, also took a bad turn and gave up after 1980. Right? Now, I could see that coming. I did want to arm against it. The essay in the book, The Death of the Millennial Left, or The Millennial Left is Dead, right, is from 2017. So I gave it a good year. So the irony is that I chose that moment to declare the millennial left dead after basically 10 years of 2007 to 2017, or 2006 to 2016. And I did have a sense that there might be a kind of wave of Democratic Party progressivism. So the 2018 election of the Squad, right? And the expansion of the Squad in 2020 with the second Bernie campaign, I suppose. That I could see that coming, but that was not what I meant by the millennial left. In other words, that rather symbolized the end, the terminus, and the abandonment. so I think that that's maybe the way I thought about it, is there is an opportunity here to accept the challenge. And there was, by the way, in 2017, I was talking about this recently in one of my book talks, that in 2017, some people on the left were saying, well, you know, fascism today might look different than it did in the past. It may not be neo-Nazi and new KKK. It may not be like straight white men. It might be multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial. You know, that would be the authentic new form of fascism, actually. They forgot about that pretty quickly. So there were some hesitant gestures in that direction of being open to what might be new and different. Still, I thought hampered by considering Trump to be a fascist, which again is just, I think, just wrong, historically wrong and substantially wrong. But, you know, to understand a new form of capitalist conservatism, call it fascism, but really conservatism. And that also is going to be expressed in the Democratic Party. Right, too. From my standpoint, from as regards socialism, I consider both the Democrats and the Republicans to be the right, not because I'm out there on the extreme left of the Democrats, but what we were saying earlier, because socialism would cut across and cut through the divisions in capitalist politics.
Well, on that point of socialism cutting through the divide of left and right, of that, I mean, as far as I understand Marxism, Marx is basically saying both the left and right are really both just puppets of capital in terms of the state, state structure. One of the distinctions in your book that's I guess hit home a little bit was the distinction between hardworking labor versus financial fat cats. That you say these are two sides of the same coin.
Yes.
And the reason why that hit home a little bit was because I labor under my own ideology of working hard and, you know, being productive and all that type of stuff, right? And you know, have a general political sensibility, which is, you know, it's goddamn billionaires running around with more money than 4 billion people on the planet or something like that.
Right.
You know, so this basically in the book, it's like this productive labor versus parasitic capital being two sides of the same coin. Is that saying we need to rethink leisure? We need to rethink our own like value? Like, to me, what I was thinking of is like, how do I rethink leisure? How do I rethink my own value? How do I rethink, you know, my own life in those terms?
I mean, that is part of our moment too. I do think that an authentic moment of the millennial left has been, you know, the critique of labor. So it was part of old historical Marxism. Paul Lafargue, Marx's son-in-law, The Right to be Lazy, right? You know, who was involved in the establishment of the Marxist political party in France, right? And while accepting that actually the Protestant work ethic, the bourgeois work ethic is alive and well, it's in all of us, you know? So there is a kind of utopianism to the critique of labor that is good, but is also problematical in the sense of, you know, I do think that the working class does need to be the actor, if you will, in the overcoming of capitalism, if only because it's their activity that keeps capitalism going. Right. So in other words, it's the activity of labor that has to recognize how it keeps capitalism going.
Can Can I ask you a question just quick here? Is that still true in the context of mass automation? AI, is that,
It
what do you think
is.
about
It is because, of course, there is still wage labor. There's still activity that people have to perform to survive in society. So, you mentioned David Graeber, so he has the category of bullshit jobs. And it's kind of like, well, on the one
Love
hand,
that category.
yeah, I mean, okay, here's my criticism of it. All jobs are bullshit jobs. They're all bullshit jobs, meaning, somebody has to collect the trash. Well, at the end of the day, in capitalism, that's a bullshit job too. Right? It's not just being a commodity trader on, the mercantile exchange here in Chicago, or it's not just being a barista at Starbucks that's a bullshit job, or being a retail employee at a store that's a bullshit job. The people who actually have to do the physical stuff, like mine ore out of the ground. In capitalism, that's also a bullshit job, meaning why is it done? Right? It's done to valorize capital. It's not done for the use value, or the use value is secondary to it. So that's my problem with the bullshit jobs, is that it leads you to think that there are non-bullshit jobs. So they're all bullshit jobs. And what that also means is that they're all also not bullshit jobs. Even the things that we think of as being completely useless, like, the finance sector or the real estate sector or whatever, they are performing a function, a needed function in the society. So overcoming capitalism means transforming that necessity. The necessity for both the intellectual labor that we do in capitalism and also for the physical labor that we do in capitalism, transforming that necessity, not eliminating it, but transforming it, right? And transforming our relation to it, transforming our social valuation of it, right? So I know that this sounds very abstract, but it's going to mean transforming use values, right? So the use values that we need will be transformed beyond capitalism, because we don't know what an undistorted, undominated, authentic human need might be.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, the crucial distinction that from my reading is the use versus the exchange value, and when the exchange value takes over from the use value, is that what you would consider the distortion?
Well, it could be. I mean, so I have in mind the romantic reaction. So the romantic reaction is that use values are good and exchange values are bad. The exchange value is bad because it's putting a price tag on things. It's quantification as opposed to the qualitative, right? And it's one of the reasons why, like, the value critics, the Wertkritik, the kind of serious Marxologists will say, well, it's not use value and exchange value, it's use value and value, right? They'll use that language. I think that's a little bit of a red herring, and it doesn't necessarily clarify much, because use value and exchange value are both parts of value, right? So again, it's not the contradiction between use value and value, meaning we want to get rid of value but somehow preserve use value. Because again, what counts as utility, social utility, will change. And so again, that's the really utopian vision, is that it's not like, okay, we want to do what we do now, but just get rid of the profit motive. Because that's how the exchange value is understood. It's understood as the profit motive, that profit is basically a ripoff in exchange, meaning that people are not paid for the actual value of their labor. Exploitation is taking place, meaning that somehow it's an unfair exchange that's happening, right? Whereas Marx famously, infamously says, no, it's a fair exchange. Workers are paid for the true value of their labor. There is a fair exchange. While he also says they produce surplus value, right? But that surplus value is not just being ripped off. That surplus value is being alienated, and it's becoming part of what's necessary to keep society going, right? So surplus value is necessary. But the form that it takes in capitalism is the false necessity. And the false necessity is not money. It's not being ripped off in exchange. It's not being exploited by being paid too little, right? That's not the false necessity. The profit motive is not the false necessity. The false necessity is capital, and that's a tricky category because it means the way we use things now, technology as it's implemented now, our whole realm of social necessity, social needs, how they're met now, right? So another thing that I would say is what I've learned in my study of Marxism is that it's not anti-capitalist. Marxism understands socialism not simply as anti-capitalism. Right, so it means conceiving of the world that we live in a different way, right? Not seeing it as just a rotten system and a huge ripoff and a horrible form of injustice and exploitation. Now, the reason that I say that is not to kind of give justification to the way the world is, but to say that the struggle for social justice is inadequate to what has to happen. And also that the struggle for social justice is actually what keeps capitalism going. It's what revolutionizes capitalism. It's what maintains capitalism, actually.
Very important. I'm having something come to my mind just because I've been listening to it recently. I've been listening to some of Yanis Varoufakis's
Yes.
recent talks on techno-feudalism.
Yes.
And it's, to me, I'd like to get your view, because to me it's convincing, or at least to me. And the reason why I'm bringing it up now the way I'm bringing it up is because of actually what you said of Marxism is not anti-capitalist.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I think about it, or the way I have thought about it in the past, is more like it's a fractal, in terms of there's primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism, in terms of the historical development, historical unfolding. And that my interpretation of Varoufakis is that all of the platform capitalists, Amazon, he gives the example of Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, that because there's not, as it were, any sort of regulation for these international organizations, there's no proper taxation systems or anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
that they basically become feudal lords and they collect rents off of us. And it's sort of the sense of actually going from the national level to the international level, there's actually been a regression from capitalism to feudalism.
Mm.
It's techno-feudalist. So yeah, I mean, my ideas are kind of fuzzy here, but what's coming to your mind when I say these things?
So I had the opportunity, thankfully, recently to watch a explanation of the concept of techno-feudalism by Varoufakis himself. And what he said is that it's not capitalism anymore, because it's not production and it's not markets and it's not even profit making, and therefore it's not like surplus value production in the old Marxist sense. And that the capitalists themselves are being exploited by the techno-feudalists, right? And so it's an interesting formulation where he's talking about a distortion of the capitalist economy such that it no longer corresponds to the old Marxist definition of capitalism. So with the old Marxist definition of capitalism, according to Varoufakis, capitalism itself was defined by struggle over surplus value. But that techno-feudalism is a situation in which you can't even have that struggle. Right? Now, what's interesting there is that struggle over surplus value, meaning he folded into that two different things. One is ordinary capitalist politics, and the other is the struggle for socialism. So what he's saying is that techno-feudalism has done away not only with the struggle for socialism, but also the struggle that characterizes ordinary capitalist politics. Right? Like market competition, competition for profits, profit seeking, but also more generally, struggle over the disposition of surplus value in society. So social democracy. The class struggle as a constitutive element of capitalism, and not simply not the class struggle meaning going beyond capitalism, but the class struggle as the engine of capitalism, which is the way Marx and original historical Marxists understood it. They understood the class struggle of the working class to be what makes capitalism happen. And so he was saying that's all been bypassed by the rent seeking of the techno overlords. And that's an interesting, kind of formulation. It is. I don't think that it's quite right. And I also think that what it aims for is what he says, the reestablishment of democracy. Because democracy is a place where you can have politics and you could have a struggle over the disposition of surplus value. You could have a struggle over the shape of capitalism. That is the struggle between capitalists and also between workers and capitalists. But he's saying that's all been circumvented by the new techno mediated, I guess internet really mediated form of capitalism that short circuits and prevents politics. So what's good about Verifocus, but I think that could get lost when people on the left think about it, is that really what he's calling for, and he says this, he says, I'm nostalgic for the bourgeois individual. Right? He's what he's really interested in is restoring bourgeois democracy, ordinary capitalist democracy, liberal democracy, right? So he says, I'm nostalgic for the liberal bourgeois individual, and that's gone. It's gone among the capitalists, and it's gone among the workers too. So that would be my other point is, one of the things that I've really emphasized in my work, and it's not so much in this volume, it will be in the next volume, is how Marxists understood the struggle for socialism to be on the basis of the liberal individualism of the working class. Right? So ordinarily we think, oh, the liberal individualism, that's the capitalist class, and then the socialist collectivism, that's the working class. But no, actually it was based on appealing to workers as individuals, having them make reasoned political judgments, not just enforced collective solidarity. No, actually no. Right? And understanding democracy in liberal terms, meaning democracy is about appealing to individuals. It's not about appealing to groups. Right? So the problem is, again, this is a little bit of Stalinism. It is. That Marxism was really falsified, distorted into collectivism. And that's not only true in the East, like the nominally communist-led countries, but also affected the way people understood politics in the West, politics in liberal democracy, to our detriment, because it actually conforms to the Democrats more than it does to the actual struggle for socialism. I mean, the Democrats does group politics, group identity politics.
Can we dwell on this for a moment? Yeah. This distinction between individual and collective?
Yeah.
Because I feel like it's such a symptom.
Yeah.
And I see it coming out in political circles, religious circles, other circles, where there's this, to me, we have to defend against this communitarian herd mentality.
Yes.
And we have to, in fact, yes, we can critique liberalism. Yes, we can critique neoliberalism. But there is something, like I remember reading, for example, the first time reading Kant's What is Enlightenment.
Yep.
In Kant's What is Enlightenment, he starts off the book saying, you can use your own understanding. And I'm reading it there, I'm like as if like he's speaking to an audience, like, oh, I could use my own understanding.
Exactly.
Then he goes on in the second page and he's like, you know what? Even women should use their own understanding. But but like, to me, this is
nominal sexism, by the way. So what he says is that most people, most of the time, lack the use of their understanding. So most men, and then he says, and the entire fair sex, meaning most men and all women. And what he says is, we're all capable of it, but we choose not to out of laziness and cowardice. And laziness, okay, cowardice. So dare to think. Dare to know.
This is carried on in when Nietzsche talks about the Overman.
Yeah,
He's basically saying laziness and cowardice as well.
that's right.
He's saying the rabble is the lazy and the cowardice. And anyway, so there's this line, and so I'll go a little bit more how you articulate Marxism as not a collectivist phenomenon, but actually something that moves through liberalism. I would say sublates liberalism. Is that the correct way to say
Seeks
it?
to. Yeah, absolutely.
Seeks to sublate liberalism.
Yes.
But moves through
it.
Moves through the individual. And then to me, that's where, for me, the thing I like about Hegel's logic is the universal and the singular.
Yeah.
That the universal and the singular are thought together. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Because of course you can't have one without the other. Right.
It's just and I feel like where we are, at least I see some symptoms that there's a symptom of a regression to a universalism without singularity.
Yeah, there's a regression to collectivism. So what I'll say about this is that, of course, this is the specter of Trump. The specter of Trump is that he's a white Christian nationalist, America First nationalism, that it's the abandonment of a global cosmopolitan society, but it's also an abandonment of multiculturalism and diversity at home in the United States. And of course, it's not that at all, but it can be taken up easily to seem like that, even positively. So the left has rejected Trump as some kind of a racist nationalist, a bad collectivist. Now, what they want to put in place of that is unclear, right? Again, it tends to be the Democratic Party version of like a rainbow coalition, intersectionality. But also on the right. So I was with Sublation as a project in dialogue with the editor of Compact magazine, Sohrab Ahmari in New York, who recently published a book, Tyranny Incorporated. So we had a book talk in which we talked about each other's books. And, he is definitely someone who's trying to restore a kind of traditional community. Now, for him, he's a kind of Catholic. He's a Catholic convert. So there's a kind of a Catholic Christian understanding of community and a kind of collective solidarity. But also America. He's an immigrant. And you also see that with Vivek Ramaswamy as a candidate in the Republican primaries. There's this kind of like, we're Americans by choice. We want to be part of this American community. And, that does include us, actually. We don't feel excluded by it. And, so there is this general drift. And I think that, as I point out in my book, when the left fails, the task is taken up by the right. Meaning, when the left abandons the task of thinking about how the struggle to overcome capitalism has to fulfill the individual and collective realities of society, right? That when that is abandoned, when it's kind of cut short, then the right takes it up. And again, I knew from the outset early on that one antinomy that beset the left was individualism versus collectivism. And I knew that a great limitation was going to be that neoliberalism itself was understood as individualism, which is wrong, actually, even about neoliberalism, but also more broadly, capitalism would be seen as individualism, right? And that socialism would be seen as collectivism. And also the answer to neoliberalism was a kind of return to social democracy. So this is what you see with the DSA. So somehow the idea being that the New Deal and the Great Society were better because they were more collective in character and less individualist in character, the way neoliberalism has become individualistic. And I thought, well, but what about the fact, and I raised this with Sohrab Ahmari, what about the fact that the collective aspect of capitalism was rebelled against in the 60s? That the New Left did rebel against what they found to be a kind of repressive, stifling conformism of that form of capitalism, right? That he would want to go back to. So these are a conservative, in some ways he's more honest about the New Deal being conservative, about the welfare state being conservative. And he does think in a way that I think the left is very confused about, but he thinks more honestly, more directly, like, well, it's a world of nation states. So you do have to start with one's own nation state. Right? So there is a kind of like, yes, nationalism. Not of a particularly right-wing or repressive character, but still kind of accepting that, rather than thinking, well, capitalism, there's a tension, we might say, there's actually a contradiction between the fact that it's a global capitalist reality and you have nation states. That's actually a contradiction, right? It's not that, oh, the nation state is the unit of capitalism. No, actually, capitalism has been a crisis of the nation state throughout its entire history. And is still today. So I think, again, through these rather obscure phenomena from a Marxist perspective, and yet also a very glaringly obvious and clear set of phenomena in our time, we actually can see the contradiction of capitalism. You don't have to go to use value, exchange value. You could go to individual and collective in society. You could go between particular and universal.
Yeah. So this is really helpful. Specifically, I can see your analysis of the problem where capitalism has totally become equated with individualism, and socialism totally associated with collectivism, and this language itself somehow needs to be disentangled, developed in a more philosophically rigorous sense.
And we do need to return to people like Kant and Hegel, who did think
right.
about these things, and who Marx took for granted. It's not like Marx rejected. He thought, okay, this has been understood.
Right.
We've lost that.
Well, that's sort of been my that was the original motive for Philosophy Portal. Was I'm going back to those original sources. I'm going to try and teach them as best as I can and try to establish some philosophical ground before going as deep into Marxism as I was, before having the philosophical backbone to understand the history of these ideas. But coming back to your book, I want to try and connect the individualism and the collectivism, potentially trying to connect it in with the rise of intersectionality, the form of collectivism we see there, and the end of the book being seemingly centered around basically, well, you say the black question in the USA.
That's an old Marxist expression.
Okay, so maybe unpack that. I didn't know it was an old Marxist expression. Maybe unpack why frame it as the black, of course, black and white tension, but in terms of intersectionality, I feel like a lot of the original voices leading to intersectionality were often centering the black and white tension in the USA, and maybe what are your thoughts around this?
So I'll just confess to a deficit in the book. I don't take up Me Too. I mention it, but I don't really take it up, right? So I do take up Black Lives Matter, and we could say the prehistory of Black Lives Matter, from the earlier moment in the millennial left. Now, okay, so the culmination of the book is Republicans and riots. So it's looking at the George Floyd protests and riots of 2020. And then that's followed by an epilogue, the American Revolution and the left. So in some ways, the book sort of rounds out its trajectory on Republicans and riots, on the Black Lives Matter moment. Now, again, the question is, intersectionality tends to be race and gender, right? So Combahee River Collective, Black feminists, and also Black lesbian feminists, right? Let's just add one more, right? Race, gender, sexuality, what I like to refer to in my classes as the trifecta of the 60s New Left social movements. Well, what about class? In other words, is class just another identity? It's another group identity. So what we'll find is that all of these are collectives, right? So Black identity is a kind of Black collective. Gender is a collective. Sexuality can also be turned into a collective identity rather than an individual kind of predilection. Gay identity as opposed to homosexual acts, right? So these are all categories of collective identity, but at the level of social groups. And then society is reimagined as a collection of groups. So I want to just recall something. So we just happened to in Platypus this last summer. So when thinking about the individual and the collective in society, of course, there's sociology. There's classic bourgeois sociology. There's like Emile Durkheim, and the earlier tradition. And the Frankfurt School takes up that stuff. And I think it's a rich way of thinking that the left generally neglects. They don't think about society per se. It's worth doing. But this last summer we did politics and Marxism, or Marxism and politics. And we looked at an essay of Marcuse's from the 1930s. And it's titled "The Struggle Against Liberalism in the Totalitarian View of the State." So he basically takes up like fascist anti-liberalism. And what he says there is that these fascist anti-liberals just put the nation in the place of the individual. In other words, the nation becomes an individual. Right? In other words, that's another way of thinking about the dialectic of individual and collective, is the danger that the collective just becomes an individual. And that's especially apparent when thinking of social group identities and the rainbow coalition kind of politics of the Democratic Party. Now, what's interesting is that the Republicans, from the Democrat perspective, the Republicans represent white supremacy and patriarchy, meaning any women who vote for the Republican Party are just succumbing to the patriarchy, and any Blacks or other minorities who vote Republican are just succumbing to white supremacy. That's a nice little trick, isn't it? But what it does is it actually leaves the Republican Party holding the banner of bourgeois universalism, right, against the particularism of the social group identities. And I think intersectionality was an attempt to deal with that emerging reality at the end of the 1970s, meaning the New Left was cracking up, it was falling apart, it was splintering, it was fracturing along these lines. In other words, it's women, lesbian women taking part in the Black movement who felt very alienated by the Black movement, by the patriarchy and homophobia, sexism of the Black movement, right? And we're making a plea for how do we not allow this movement to disintegrate, right? Well, it did disintegrate, and it also didn't disintegrate, meaning it was reassembled in the Democratic Party, right, as the Rainbow Coalition. And within a few short years, in the 80s, against Reagan, right? And so we see that again now. But I'm also, and again, this is where Adolf Fried was such an important mentor for me, I'm very much aware of the repressive character of collectivism, meaning that identity politics is not really Black versus white. It's really about what kind of Black person are you? It's about Black people policing other Black people. And by the way, white people playing a part in that too. And similarly, feminism is about women policing other women, right? What's the right way to be a woman? I see that as intensely conservative, right? And in other words, it's a kind of an enforced collective identity that doesn't allow for actual plurality. It doesn't allow for that. So again, the right is left saying viewpoint diversity. Well, of course, like, in other words, I think I got into trouble at some point. It's on the back of my book. You'll see that Doug Henwood, a friend of Adolf Fried's, who is the editor, publisher of Left Business Observer, he was going to be on a Platypus panel in New York, and he said, "Oh well." He objected to, the fact that it was a lot of straight white men. It wasn't. The panel was not all straight white men at all. You know, there was an Indian guy and a black guy on the panel. And I responded to him. I said, well, we're more interested in ideological diversity than in social identity diversity. And he took that to be some kind of implicit racism and sexism. Right? And of course, it's a white guy doing that. It's a white guy doing that. And I feel like that's really the game. That's really the game. And again, it's horrible because, it's like unity and diversity, but what character does that take? Does it take just ascribed social group identity, or does it mean actually a plurality of viewpoints, of perspectives? The vital political differences that have to exist, right? Which are not, it's not like, I mentioned this standpoint epistemology. There's another horror. The idea that somehow, if you're in a certain social position, that determines your outlook. Not at all. Right? I'm sure that there are a hell of a lot of poor Black lesbian women who are conservative, actually.
Well, actually, I mean, it kind of reinforces the Republican conservative movement, because what always happens, I mean, let me just throw out some names like Candace Owens, for example.
Yeah.
They just find the Black woman that happens to be conservative and they platform.
So there are a lot of them, though. There are a lot of them. I mean, I'm thinking, I think Condoleezza Rice might be a closet lesbian.
Right. Well, Candace Owens is not a lesbian, but you know what I mean. Right. They find the identity group which short circuits the ideology.
Although sometimes Candace Owens is hectoring like a nun.
Right. No. Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Right. And but but then what people on the left will do, because the right will do whatever. What the left will do is they will say she's somehow not an authentic Black woman. About Candace Owens, they'll de-authenticate her Blackness and her femininity.
But this is
how does that work?
Garbage.
No, it's ugly. It's quite ugly. There's a Joe Freeman article called Trashing. That's a classic. That's about how feminists just end up trashing each other. Right? And, we now call it cancel culture. It used to be called more directly trashing. People just trashing each other. And it's disgusting because, like I said, in the background, it's the dominant identities anyway. Right? In other words, it's like, at the end of the day, okay, Black people are going to trash each other, women are going to trash each other, queers are going to trash each other. And how does that help anybody? How does that help the women, the Blacks, the queers? It does not. Right?
I mean, I think to me, if I go back to the philosophy, I find myself returning to the division in the phenomenology of spirit between religion and absolute knowing. Mm-hmm. Because in the division between religion and absolute knowing, you kind of have, at least in my interpretation, you have like the failure of the community in religion, mm-hmm. opening up to absolute knowing, mm-hmm. which is a differentiation. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that, is coming back to that, is that I feel like the problem that you're pointing towards, I feel like we're discussing, is the problem of modern differentiation. And how do we really think differentiation? Like you're saying, like viewpoint diversity, right?
Individuation, to use a sociological term, or maybe even a psychological term, individuation. Yeah. Meaning we become different. We are not simply different by virtue of our origin, but we become different by becoming the individuals that we are. That's really the issue. And this society both allows for that, necessitates it actually, but it also severely constrains it.
Yes.
So I do think that we have an authentic anxiety at our individuality too
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
capitalism,
Yeah.
right?
Well, tell me about it.
We don't want to be we don't want to be individuals. We want to find a collective to conform to.
I know, and it's that anxiety which is to me the deepest struggle in terms of where I find myself, and in that sense I can be sympathetic with people who want a group, they want a collective identity. To me, it's a response to anxiety.
Yeah, very much. So again, society both demands that we be individuals and undermines our capacity to be individuals. Also, society in capitalism demands our adherence to the collective in a particular way. It does. So it necessitates collectivism. It also necessitates individualism. And those are contradictory demands placed on us by capitalism. And we have to transform those necessities in overcoming capitalism, meaning we don't want to negate the collective, we don't want to negate the individual, but we want to realize them in their dialectical interplay, in a way that in capitalism we only get a kind of very distorted and really divided reality, right? A kind of schizophrenic reality rather than a kind of synthesis, right? And again, liberalism, its conception was this living interplay of individual and collective. Now, that would be classical liberalism, Kant and Hegel, and the thinkers of their time. Liberalism ends up being a kind of reification of the individual. So I feel like people on the left, they hear liberalism and they think it's one step away from Ayn Rand, right? But even Ayn Rand would need to be understood properly. In other words, what the hell? Where did that come from? And how does it speak to people? Because it does. How does it appeal to people?
It does.
And yeah. I can tell you, it doesn't only appeal to straight white men. It does not.
Definitely no.
Right? Yeah. And
well, she was extremely influenced by Nietzsche.
Yes, that's true too. Although kind of a bad reading of Nietzsche in some ways, but still.
I agree. Right? But she was like massively influenced.
That's right. And certainly it's a better influence of Nietzsche than, like, I don't know, people who think that like fascism is Nietzschean. Right? So again, like you could say, okay, I mean, I think it's more of a stretch to say that Nietzsche justifies fascism. You could say more plausibly that Nietzsche justifies a kind of libertarian individualism. Right? But even that, I think, is doing a disservice to the authentic thought. I mean, not that I mean to trash Ayn Rand exactly, but she can be a little bit of a caricature of herself.
Yeah.
So...
Well, what I always thought with Ayn Rand in terms of her stories was that the good and the evil were too reified. Like if you want a good narrative, there's some ambiguity in the characters. Like they're like where you
sure.
Where the good guy can confront evil, and the evil person can, you can even want to root for him or something like that. But there's none of this ambiguity in her writing, I find.
Yeah, no, there are better dystopian novels than Ayn Rand.
Well, let's in terms of Death of the Millennial Left, maybe we could get just some sort of anticipation for the second volume. You said this one is, say, more practical or more commentary on political events and the eras we've been through politically, at least in the US. And then the next volume is going to be more theoretical. So maybe definitely recommend, I'm going to leave a link in the description to Death of the Millennial Left. Highly recommend checking it out. Maybe once people have picked that out, what can they expect from you moving forward?
Okay, so the second volume, which is going to come out early next year, there's a little preview of it in the Underground Theory book that we're both in.
Yeah.
So the Negative Dialectic of Marxism is one of the essays, but there are many, many such little essays. And so, taking up different themes, different topics in the very rich field of Marxist theory, even looked at from a fairly, what might strike a lot of people on the left as a kind of narrow orthodox perspective. Actually, it's a lot richer field than one might think, and so I mentioned Marx, Lenin, and Adorno. You could think of the second book being about grasping the essential core of thought that they all have in common, right? The dialectical conception of capitalism, the dialectical conception of the struggle for socialism. So that's in the Negative Dialectic of Marxism, the essay I mentioned that's in Underground Theory. The idea that Marxism might have found the necessity of the dialectic in the fact that the struggle for socialism is itself contradictory, right? And the understanding, the workers' movement, the class struggle, the workers' movement for socialism was itself self-contradictory, and it's part of the contradiction of capitalism, actually, right? It's not some other thing. So again, it's not opposed principles, collectivism, individualism, that kind of thing. So that is, if I were to describe the core of it, is the idea that what defines Marxism is the dialectic, and how that is connected very directly to the political vision that original historical Marxism had, and how that is developed, sustained by Lenin and by others of his, I have an essay on Rosa Luxemburg, for example, and but also preserved by the Frankfurt School, right? So what about Marxism was sustained by the Frankfurt School as critical theory? What is that about? Right. So those are, like, what's the original dialectical conception of capitalism and socialism in Marx? Politically, actually. How is that pursued by later Marxists like Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin? And then how is that sustained at a theoretical level by people like Lukács and Karl Korsch and Benjamin, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse?
The whole gang.
So, yeah. And I also, this will be of interest to you and your viewers, I think. I have a few essays on psychoanalysis and Marxism.
That will be of interest. Yeah, that will. I'm teaching Lacan at the moment.
So I have an essay on Freud, an essay on Wilhelm Reich and the critique of fascist psychology, and I have an essay that I published the same month that Trump was elected on Adorno and the broader Frankfurt School's approach to authoritarianism as a psychological phenomenon, but also as a political phenomenon. In other words, what the dialectical critique of authoritarianism would be, rather than the denunciation of it, which is the way it's usually taken to mean, but rather what would a actual immanent and dialectical critique of authoritarianism be, and how that does pull from psychoanalytic approaches. And Fanon is there too. Fanon as a contemporary, roughly, younger, of course, but basically a contemporary of the Frankfurt School. He straddles the generations between the Frankfurt School and the New Left, Fanon. But how, Fanon's approach to a psychoanalytic grasp of racism is very much in the Marxist mode, actually. So again, that's one part of the book that I know will be of interest to you and your viewers. And so so I deal with these things at the level of, again, more theoretical themes. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad. Well, first off, it's been a genuine pleasure to get to know you in the last year, just through watching your stuff on YouTube, because I know we met briefly at one of Dave's live streams,
Yeah,
but
that's right.
I hadn't read your work or watched any of your videos at that point, and I've really enjoyed getting to know your voice and getting to know your perspective. And again, I would recommend to the viewers to pick up Death of the Millennial Left, which I'll leave a link in the description, as well as a link to
Thank
the
you.
Platypus Society,
Thank you.
which is doing great work. And again, there's been some connections that I didn't realize we had indirectly through the Platypus Society. So I'll be interested to learn more about that in the years to come. Maybe if you could leave our viewers with a final thought. Is there a final thought you'd like to leave the leave the viewers with in regards
Well,
to the death of the millennial left?
right. So it's not a cause for despair.
Mm-hmm.
It's a moment for reflection. And I did feel very strongly about publishing this book this year because I thought, well, we can be in a kind of a pause before the election next year. And so I did think of this time as a reflective moment, which can be mistaken for a moment of despair. Right? To treat that as actually it's time to take a pause, to reflect, to think. And so I thought, let's use this moment as an opportunity to reflect. And that's what these books are really meant to do, especially The Death of the Millennial Left. So this first volume is really about let's take a pause, think back on the history we've lived through, and try to salvage something from it rather than being overwhelmed by despair in the wake of it.
It's a message that I needed, and I think many other people need. So thank you again for this conversation, and
Great.
for everyone who's been with us for the whole time. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.